Good morning, I hope you are well. Welcome to another video from Ahmad Science UK. This one is particularly requested by a student who wanted to focus on diffusion for her revision. Please, as always, like and subscribe. It helps me to know exactly what it is that I'm trying to aim for and what I'm trying to build for. So all the social links are on the screen in front of you. In terms of today's lesson, we're going to be focused on diffusion, like I said, and the four areas that we're aiming to cover today is to explain what is meant by diffusion and give examples from cells, so that's animal cells and plant cells. Describe factors that affect the rate of diffusion. So when we talk about this word rate, we are talking ultimately about how quickly something is happening. Explain how surface area to volume ratio will affect the rate of diffusion in cells. So this thing here we need to be able to calculate. Just drop my pen, it's fine. Surface area to volume ratio. You need to be able to calculate that for your exams and then make comparisons between different sizes of cells or living organisms. And then finally explain how multicellular organisms are adapted to allow for sufficient diffusion of molecules. Now let's take a second and break that down. What do we mean by multicellular? Well, multi means more than one, and then cellular is referring to cells. And then this other thing here, sufficient diffusion. Who decides what is sufficient? Well, if the organism is still alive, then great, that's sufficient. That's what we're trying to achieve whenever we're talking about diffusion into and out of cells. Right? Now, the first thing I want you to think of is how could you fill up a plane as quickly as possible? And I know that's kind of gone left wing, but I need you to bear with me for a second. I've got a plane that's got 400 passengers and I need to fill that up as quickly as possible. How do I do that? Well, if I think of a standard plane, what I've got is a situation where I've got people coming in and out of these entrances here. And clearly, as you can imagine, as you're walking through the plane, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this, you have to wait for the person in front to move out of the way. Now, this is actually a very, very good model for when we come to talk about diffusion. The reason being is actually you want to increase the number of people that get on as quickly as possible in order to make sure that your plane is filled up as quickly as possible, and then you can take off and you're away from the runway. However, how could I do that? How could I increase this plane's ability to take on more passengers? Well, first of all, you need people here. Let's draw. Obviously, that person is much bigger than an actual plane. But you need people to keep ushering the passengers along. You need them to keep a steady flow of passengers down the plane so that they can find their seats. Secondly, another thing that you could do is you could actually have a couple more entrances. Yeah, so you can either have more entrances or you can make sure that there's a continuous flow of people as they are going through the plane. Both things will mean that as passengers go down and sit down in the plane, you've got another space where you can add another passenger. And this is actually quite a good analogy for diffusion. I'll explain why in a second. So what is diffusion? Well, diffusion is actually the random movement of particles, and as they move randomly, they start to spread out. And that random movement, first of all, is called Brownian motion, and that's one thing that you need to be able to describe and you need to be able to identify. So particles move constantly and randomly all the time. Really straightforward. Oh my god, did you see that animation? It took me ages. I did it for every individual particle. Do it again. Why? But as you can see in the middle, the reason why they don't mix is because they've got a barrier in between. Yeah, and if I was to take the barrier away and I was allowing the particles to move freely and mix, then eventually what you'd end up is not a situation where you've got all the red particles on one side and all the yellow particles on another side. What you'd actually end up is a situation where you've got red and yellow particles mixed pretty well in whatever container that you've got. That means that overall there will be a net movement of particles from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. What does that mean? Well, if I just focused on this area here, clearly the red particles are in high concentration, there's loads of them, and there's not many yellow particles. So there's a high concentration of red particles and a low concentration of yellow particles. Conversely, if I did the same thing here, exact same principle applies. There's a low concentration of yellow particles and a high concentration of yellow particles and pretty much no red particles whatsoever. And then if you allowed them to mix, and this is going to be quick, but if you allowed them to mix, then clearly you can see the yellow particles and the red particles start to mix. Now, I'll be honest, my animation and patience doesn't allow me to show you the final product in the same animation, but you get the idea. Now, in terms of cells, well, why is this important? If you think about most things that cells need, as they start to use them up, there will be pretty much no molecules that are useful to a cell inside a cell, and there'll be loads of molecules that are useful, particularly with the way that transport systems work in animals and plants outside of the cell. So the cell needs to work out a way to get particles inside, and what it does is it allows them to cross the cell membrane. Okay, so initially you start off with loads of particles outside, they're in a high concentration, and you end up with no particles inside where there's a low concentration. So according to diffusion, according to the principles of diffusion, what's going to happen? Well, eventually substance will move into and out of the cell across the cell membrane. Okay, so you've got a situation where you've got substances moving in, diffusing across the cell membrane, and this is a very zoomed in picture of what is happening at a cell membrane. Now, eventually what you'll end up with is a situation where you've got equal amounts of a substance outside the cell and inside the cell. Yeah. So, what actual examples from an animal can we take? And humans is the easiest one to apply this to because it's one that we're most familiar with. So let's look at oxygen diffusing into the blood. Now, clearly, when you breathe in, you've got a very large concentration of oxygen in your lungs, but you need to get that from your lungs into your blood. Now, here what you can see is there's a very high concentration in the lungs, but not so much in the blood. And what the oxygen molecules will do, because the oxygen molecules are small, is they will diffuse across the membrane, cell membranes, and go into the blood. Okay, well, that's great, but eventually you will reach a situation where you've got equal amounts of oxygen in the blood and in your lungs, but that's not very useful for you because you need to constantly breathe in, right? And you need constant supply of oxygen. So how does a human body deal with that? And it's very clever. The human body deals with that because the blood flows, obviously, in terms of blood is constantly moving around your body. So these hemoglobin molecule, these red blood cells will eventually move on, and you will end up with a fresh supply of red blood cells which do not have oxygen, and then you maintain, and this is an important bit, is you maintain a diffusion gradient. You maintain a diffusion gradient, and a diffusion gradient is a difference in concentrations between two separate regions. Okay, now oh sorry, you can't actually read in the notes, so let's put that on. Some substances transport in and out of cells by diffusion are oxygen and carbon dioxide in gas exchange. Another example of this is the waste product urea from cells is diffusing into the blood plasma, which then gets excreted by for excretion, stored in the kidney. Now, I know this example, relax. I know this example is different. The reason I wanted to use glucose diffusing into cells is because in the second example as well, you've got something moving into the blood. However, it also moves out of the blood, and therefore I wanted to present the example of glucose. So you've got a large amount of glucose in your bloodstream, which is maintained by the body's systems of homeostasis, and you want that glucose to go into cells so it can be used for respiration. So you want that glucose to go into the cells, and clearly again the same thing. You can see there's a high concentration of glucose in the blood and there's a low concentration of glucose in the cells, but unlike the first example, the cells aren't really going anywhere, so you need to maintain a diffusion gradient. So you need to, like I said in the previous slide, you need to use up the glucose, and as you use up, you lower the concentration of glucose in the cells, and therefore you continue or you maintain that diffusion gradient, which allows your body to take up glucose. Now, in terms of things that affect the rate of diffusion, and again, what do we mean by rate? So we are ultimately talking about how quickly something is happening, the speed of diffusion. Sorry, that's really bad writing, but you'll get over it. In terms of the rate of diffusion, is affected by several different factors, and again, I'm gonna little blue box with the notes inside at the bottom, so that's what you're writing down if you're making notes. You need to maintain a concentration gradient. I've talked about that already in the previous two examples, but ultimately the bigger the difference in concentration between two areas, the faster diffusion is going to happen. Just knocking everything over here. Next, temperature. The higher the temperature, the faster the rate of diffusion. Why? Well, think about it. If you've got a high temperature, particles will have a larger amount of kinetic energy, they have more energy to move around, and therefore they're going to move from a region of high concentration to low concentration faster. Diffusion distance. If you can minimize that, if you can make that 1 cell thick, or you can make any diffusion distance as small as possible, it is clearly going to happen much faster. If you think of a runner, if you ask Usain Bolt to run 10 meters compared to 100 meters, he's clearly going to do that much faster, right? Surface area. Now, cells are really interesting in the sense that if you take a cell, how do I increase the surface area of a cell? Well, that's my cell right there. In order to increase the surface area, some cells will have these projections. What does that do? Well, actually, you've gone from a surface area of that to a surface area of all of that, and it's very easy, as it were, for particles to diffuse across a much larger surface area, and therefore it will mean that your rate of diffusion is faster. And then finally, the size of the molecules. Yeah. Oh, let's go back a second. Too quick. Size of the molecules. Obviously, the smaller the molecule, the faster the rate of diffusion. The larger the molecule, the slower the rate of diffusion. If you think about molecules like oxygen, etc., oxygen, glucose, small molecules which will diffuse across the cell membrane quite easily. Yeah. So you need to remember how many? Five factors that affect the rate of diffusion. Right. So I'm gonna stop the video there. For the second part, where we look at how to calculate surface area to volume ratio and why that's important, you need to watch the next video. Take care, look after yourselves, and be safe. As always, please make sure that you like, subscribe, and all those things which help me to grow the channel. Take care. Bye.